One of the most common metaphors to describe learning in the first year of medical school is that it's like a fire hose of information. There's a lot of information that you need to learn, and you have to learn fast. I'm Dr. Althea Kaminske, Senior Director of Student Academic Support and Achievement here at IU School of Medicine. In this series, I'll be exploring the learning strategies to help you manage that fire hose of information. The way that I define note-taking here in this context is probably a little bit different than how you think of note-taking. Here, I think of note-taking as a living record, as anything that provides a record of your learning and where you're at. Ideally, this record is continually updated so that it's kind of a living document of where you are and your progress towards your learning goals. With this in mind, your notes can be anything from handwritten notes, typed notes, flashcards, really any collection of documents that's providing that living record of what you're learning and where you're at in relation to your goals. What makes notes good or effective depends on your goals. For example, one of the questions I get asked most often is whether or not it matters if you have handwritten notes or typed out notes. I would argue that the format doesn't matter so much as the processes that you're engaged in when you're making those notes. Effective note-taking in medical school should achieve several goals. First, it should be formatted in a way that aids in subsequent retention. Second, they need to condense that fire hose of information down into something a little bit more manageable. Third, they need to be made in a way that builds understanding of the material. Fourth, again, they need to be a living document that accurately reflects your learning and your progress towards your learning goals. So how can you use your notes once you've written them down? Retrieval practice is one of the most powerful things you can do to improve your memory. Simply put, retrieval practice is just recalling or bringing information to mind. Every time you bring that piece of information to your mind, you're actively rebuilding or reconstructing that memory, making it more likely that you'll remember it again in the future. Research has shown that it's one of the most powerful things you can do to improve your memory, your understanding, and your application of information. Another thing to know about is spacing. Spacing is simply spacing out your practice of information. So let's say you were going to sit down for 2 hours to practice one day, maybe with flashcards, maybe with Anki. Spacing would say that you would get more out of that if you were to space out those sessions, little 30-minute chunks at a time, right? So 30 minutes throughout the course of the day, 4 times. So your overall amount of studying, the overall amount of effort you put in is the same, but you've spaced out over time. Further, it would be even more effective if, let's say, you did 2 30-minute sessions on one day and then did 2 30-minute sessions the next day, and you had some sleep in between. That's probably going to be even better for your long-term memory and retention because you've had the benefit of sleep in between. In the book Study Without Stress, the authors go through 5 different note-taking formats. They go through flashcards, diagrams, flowcharts, charts and tables, and then a combination of all of those or parts of those. Flashcards refer to any method where you write down a cue on one side and have target information that you're trying to recall. This can happen either pen and paper. There are a variety of different programs and apps that you might use to do this, but all of them achieve the same goal of making a flashcard. Flashcards are excellent for remembering things like lists, definitions, and terms. They're also really easy to sort, to score, to do things like spaced retrieval practice. They also have another really big benefit, which is you can monitor your own learning really easily. It's very easy to know when you've correctly recalled 80%, 90%, 20%, whatever it is. So they make it really easy to record and accurately monitor your learning progress. However, while flashcards are really useful for those specific things, they're not as useful or beneficial for placing things in context, for understanding complex relationships, for understanding processes. Those are going to be things that you're going to use other note-taking formats for. One of the most common questions I get is whether or not you should be using digital flashcards. But here again, the format doesn't really matter so much as what you're doing with it. For both of these different types of flashcards, my advice and recommendation is the same. It's generally better if you are the one who is creating the flashcard decks. You know which terms, lists, definitions, whatever it is that you need to know, right? And your list may be different than somebody else's list. And so part of the learning process is that active decision making where you're sorting through and recognizing this is the information that I need to focus on Or maybe this is the information that I don't need to focus on. Another thing to be aware of is how we implement things like retrieval practice and spacing. So one thing is to make sure that you are actually retrieving the information, which is that you don't cheat and look at it later and say, oh, I knew that, I can count that as right? That's cheating a little bit. The other thing to know is that having spaced programs of practice is also really beneficial, because every time we space out that learning, that helps in our long-term retention. Also, we get the benefit of sleep in between practice sessions. So generally, spacing your practice is better than not spacing your practice, and I wouldn't get too hung up on the details in between. Regardless of whether you're using handwritten or digital flashcards, there are a few things to keep in mind to help you get the most out of it. My first suggestion is to go through your deck in one successive pass. And after you've gone through all of them, you can begin to sort your practice items into two different piles, your wrong pile and your right pile. Then after you've gone through that, you have your deck of wrong ones that you didn't get right. Go through that again, and again, sort through. Eventually, right, you should get more cards in the right pile than in the wrong pile. Once you're happy with that practice, hopefully you've moved everything over to the right pile, shuffle everything together and go through it once again. What this process does is a few different really important things. One, it helps you go through and get the most practice with the items you need the most practice with. And two, at the end, when you shuffle them all together, it means that you're getting spaced practice of those items that you previously got correct. So you're getting another chance to review them, and again, to help with long-term retention of those. Flowcharts or mind maps refer to box and arrow displays that convey sequence, order, or relationships between different items. For example, if you were trying to convey the flow of information in a neuron, you might write down dendrites and then arrow to soma, an arrow to axons, and then an arrow to terminal buttons. Flowcharts are really useful for depicting sequences and processes. They require you to break down big, complicated sequences of processes into meaningful chunks of information. They're also really easy to self-test or practice retrieval with, because you can simply cover up the boxes and arrows and rewrite them down. They also, by putting things into these discrete units, make it really easy for you to score yourself. So once again, you have a really accurate reflection of your knowledge and learning at that point in time. While flowcharts are incredibly useful for the types of information they're designed for, they're less useful for things like location and labeling, space practice of really detailed information, and certain types of relationships. It may take some practice to figure out what type of information is best conveyed in a flowchart versus a diagram. Flowcharts are most valuable when you create them yourself. Just looking at a flowchart that someone else has made is less valuable than you going through, making the decision about how you're going to break things up and how you want to make your flowchart. Now we'll talk about diagrams. Diagrams generally refer to anything that can convey information about location and labeling. So think about maybe a diagram labeling different parts of the eye or different layers of skin. Diagrams are clearly most useful for location and labeling, making them an obvious candidate for studying anatomy. Diagrams are really great because they can give you a lot of rich contextual detail about the context or things around a certain structure. Additionally, they really take advantage of a certain learning principle called dual coding, which is the advantage we have for getting information both visually and verbally, right? Because we're getting pictures with words. That's really helpful for a number of reasons. They're also really easy to practice retrieval with. You can simply cover up the labeling of a diagram to practice recalling what that structure actually is. So similar to other formats, diagrams are really good at the information that they're designed for and less good at other information. Another thing to be aware of when using diagrams is obviously it can be really difficult to redraw something by hand. It's okay to find different pictures and use those as your source. Usually, and with all the other different types of note-taking formats, I'm advising you to create your own. So here is sort of an exception to the rule where I think it's okay for you to use pre-existing diagrams and to cover up those labels. Charts and tables organize information into rows and columns, allowing for a side-by-side comparison of different factors and dimensions. Charts and tables are especially effective at condensing large amounts of information into more manageable chunks. Furthermore, deciding exactly what goes into each row or column forces you to do a lot of really good item-specific and relational processing. Once that information is put into a chart, it's really easy to practice that information and assess yourself. You always know, first of all, whether or not you've completed your chart by whether or not you have empty cells in it. And second of all, it's really easy for you to assess whether or not you've gotten 60, 80, 100% of that correct. If we contrast this to how people typically take notes over this type of information, which might be to write out paragraphs or to have long bullet pointed lists, taking these notes in a chart allows you to really accurately and quickly figure out how much of that information you can remember. It also forces you to organize it in a way that builds your understanding really, really effectively. One tip that I have for recognizing whether or not you need to make one of these charts or tables is if you find yourself making the same list kind of over and over again. For example, let's say you realize that you've been listing out the structure, function, and location of different types of neurons. That's a sign that you can combine those lists into an overall category chart, allowing you to compare and contrast the structure, function, and location of these different but related structures. While each of these formats that we've talked about can each be really useful on their own, there are times when you may need to combine them. When you may need to combine, let's say, a flowchart and a diagram. You're trying to convey both location and labeling, as well as something about a sequential process. You can do that. The key to recognizing whether or not you need a combination of these things is again to recognize what kind of information you're trying to capture and which of these different note-taking strategies would be best for that type of information. So as we wrap up our discussion of different note-taking strategies, I have a few final thoughts that I want to share with you. First, I really like thinking about notes in these different formats because I find them to be really, really useful. These different formats really achieve some of our initial goals that we set out for with note-taking, right? They help us condense large amounts of information, they help us build understanding, they help us do really good things like practice retrieval and spaced practice with, and if used effectively, they can also provide that living document so that we know where we're at with our note-taking. A final tip that I often give students is to really keep that last part in mind as you're building out these notes. Keep track of your different practice sessions with these. A key thing that I've mentioned throughout is that you should be self-testing yourself and marking down, oh, okay, I got 90% of this correct, or 20%, maybe this section was really hard for me, right? So as long as you're keeping track of that in some way, maybe it's writing it at the top of the sheet, maybe you've got a master file somewhere where you keep track of your different note-taking formats and where you were at with each session, right? That can give you a big picture, an eagle-eye view of where you're at with your learning so that you can spend your time wisely, right? So that when you go back to study for a big exam, you know exactly what areas you need to focus more on and which areas you don't have to spend as much time on. I hope this conversation on note-taking has been useful so that you can be more effective and efficient with your studying. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.